faculty using data analytics. I'm Dr. Iki from Texas Southern University. So in today's session, we have 4 speakers. So every speaker will have about 20 minutes to present their research work. Our first speaker will be Dr. Carol Atkinson-Palombo from University of Connecticut. The topic of her presentation will be captive drivers and choice riders, the overlooked constituency in transportation planning. So, Dr. Palombo, are you here?
I am actually a PhD student presenting in place of Dr. Atkinson-Palombo, who is traveling to the climate conference in Scotland currently. But I'm here, ready to present.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So the floor is yours. You can share your screen and start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Host has disabled screen sharing. Oh, never mind. It worked. All right, can you see that?
Yes, we can see.
Great, thank you. So my name is Quinn Malloy. I'm a third-year PhD student under Norman Garrick and Carol Atkinson-Palombo, both of whom could not be here today. They send their best wishes to everyone. We are from the University of Connecticut, and today I'll be talking about broadening perspectives in transportation planning. Transportation is a complex system, as many of us know, but in the United States, we treat car ownership as a normative activity. We encourage a system of automobility, and there are a number of externalities that stem from that process. This project seeks to better understand some of these costs and put them into perspective. So these are the places that we celebrate in the United States and the places that we continue to build. This is AASHTO's award-winning community development project from 2020, right? So this is a place that is very obviously extremely dangerous for individuals not in an automobile, yet these are the places that we encourage through policy and through funding. So what does this mean, right? This hasn't always been the case. This is Buffalo, New York in 1950 on the top, and then today at the bottom. So lively streets, transportation diversity, these places used to exist in the United States frequently, and they no longer do. Here's another example. This is Kansas City, Missouri during a similar time frame, right? So we have removed the diversity of the streets, the liveliness of the streets in place of automobility, in place of highways. On the right in the top image, you can see a bicycle, right? Children in the street, a bicycle, a horse. So these places were diverse. They allowed for a number of different lifestyles, and they are now extremely prescriptive in what is allowed. Here's another example. This is Chicago in 1938, imagery overlaid by the existing street pattern today. It is a highway system. It disrupts the surrounding area. It has external costs for the surrounding area. Yet these are what we continue to promote. This is the system of transportation that is prioritized in our country. So what are some of these external costs? The first one is that car crashes obviously kill and maim people globally. I think the number is at 1.35 million people worldwide die every year from car crashes. That number is likely on the rise due to the increase in fatalities. It also doesn't include the number of people that are maimed, right? So this is a significant toll. Car exhaust causes respiratory disease. This is another one. When you build highways through city, when you prioritize automobility in cities where people live, it can have this secondary effect, right? Respiratory disease, through asthma, things like that, very common. Travel times detract from free time that you can spend with family. Not just something like traffic delay, but travel times in general, longer travel times due to the structures that we build and the type of development that we prioritize. Personal vehicle use is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, something that we all know. It is the transportation in the United States is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions in 2021 or in 2019. And of that, the majority is from personal vehicle use, right? So this is not an insignificant amount of emissions. And vehicle ownership is a burdensome cost to households. People have to pay for this system individually, right? So our research focuses on this final point, the high cost of transportation to households. All of these obviously are worthy of time and resources. So household transportation costs in the United States, we define this in this work as transportation spending as a % of total household spending. Most surveys in the United States do not have income data that has an extreme degree of certainty associated with it. People are not comfortable reporting their income to the government. They sometimes mistakenly misrepresent their income. There are a number of issues with this. So we have instead chosen to go with transportation spending as a % of total household spending. Our data is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics over the 3 years from 2017 to 2019. It's quarterly data that's been annualized, and it represents a consumer unit, not a household. We will use the term household for the rest of the presentation, but consumer units are allow for multiple units, economic units within a household. We have 52,000 records. Obviously, this is not a high number of records. It is a very high number of records compared to other surveys that collect similar data, right? And we only included working households that generate income actively, so we do not include retirees or other groups that might be living off savings. This obviously might misrepresent populations like retirees or students or people who are not currently working but will work. They're living off of savings, but those groups have sort of a special circumstance when it comes to how they spend their money that can detract from the main story here. So this is vehicle ownership by decile. Almost everyone in the United States, regardless of how much money they make, right? So this is decile, this is income decile actually. So regardless of how much money they take in, almost everyone in the United States has a vehicle, at least one, almost every one of these units does. It approaches 100% for most deciles over the fourth decile, right? So even people who are in extreme poverty have a vehicle. What does this look like? This is the average annual transportation spending for the lowest decile. The lowest income decile here represents households that take in $21,600 annually per year. That's the cutoff for it. So $8,600 on transportation is not nothing. It's a significant number for households. It's a significant burden for households. And much less money is spent by households who do not have a vehicle. Why is this? These are the places that we build for people. These are places where people have no option but to drive in a car. One, this is an unpleasant place to drive regardless, even if you are driving. Two, there are no alternative forms of transportation here. There are no sidewalks. There are no soldiers. The speeds on this road encourage they encourage a high speed. It'd be uncomfortable to bike here. And this is a bus stop. This is in Massachusetts. This is a place I drive by frequently. This is a bus stop, right? So it's an uncomfortable place. It does not encourage multimodal activity use, even in this Boston to Washington corridor of high density. So these are the places that we build for people. It does not encourage someone to not own a vehicle. So captive drivers is a term that I would use to describe these people, people who have to drive a car. So they allocate 16% of their spending to transportation. And again, this is a conservative estimate. It does not include people who are retired, people who are living on their savings, who are temporarily unemployed, who are students, some of the most vulnerable populations. So this is captive drivers is a term that we're throwing out here. So resource restricted households in the first or second decile of income who do not own who do own a car, regardless of the financial burden. So these are people who must own a car to accomplish their daily travel, regardless of what it costs them financially. Significantly more detrimental than someone in a higher decile for income. There's an inverse to this group of people. This is non-vehicle ownership by income decile. It approaches zero, but never gets to zero. There is some group of people, regardless of how much money you have, who do not own vehicles. There's a larger group of people in the lowest income decile, right, who don't own vehicles, but it never gets to zero. There is no place on this graph where no one has a vehicle. Though our data set could be better and is best used at a national level, there are 2 states where you can use this information to look at state level totals. So we've classified 2 of these states, New York and Texas, 2 places that are very different from each other in terms of how they are built, to look at some of these trends. So we see that some places allow and encourage people to go without cars more frequently than other places. This is obviously what New York City looks like, a diverse transportation ecosystem where people are allowed to go without vehicles without disadvantaging themselves, right? So New York City, it's a beautiful picture, very transportation diverse. And this is Houston in 2010, right? So I might be doing Houston a disservice here, but this is clearly a system that prioritizes something that is not transportation diversity or lively streets. This is a system that prioritizes automobiles. And 24% of all of these choice riders, these high income individuals who choose not to have cars, are located in the United States, or located in New York State. These are choice riders, right? So non-resource restricted households who do not own vehicles, even though they could comfortably afford one. Choice riders. We've used these 2 new definitions to come up with something called the Transportation Choice Captivity Matrix that broadens the perspectives from the traditional perspectives to ones that capture more of these individuals. So the original captive rider, right? So someone who is forced to use transportation or transit because they cannot afford a personal automobile vehicle. Obviously, captive riders are very well discussed in the world. And their opposite would be the choice driver, that car ownership is the optimum state. And to free someone from captive ridership, you would encourage them to choose a vehicle once they had the financial resources to. Everyone would make this choice, is the assumption that our systems make. And there's the captive driver, this new group that we've discussed, a group that would benefit financially from not having a vehicle, yet still has a vehicle. So they'd benefit significantly more than others. And then there's this choice rider, right? So this group of people that choose to forego vehicle ownership, even though they could comfortably afford it. And this is the Transportation Choice Captivity Matrix. And this is how we've decided to structure our broadened perspective on transportation. These 4 groups. So one thing about this choice rider that I want to bring up is that we can choose to encourage this lifestyle and this behavior. We can decide how we build places, just like Texas did. This is a much more diverse street, a street where it would be comfortable to walk, a street with bus and bike lanes, where it's the exact same street. It still prioritizes automobiles here. It does have more diversity, and we can choose to make more places like this. So this is what this broader framework, I think, could deliver to people, right? So a more realistic vision of transportation costs in the United States, more inclusive planning is allowed when you think about the people who are coerced into vehicle ownership because their needs do not allow for anything else, their needs in the built environment. It could encourage a new poverty reduction strategy, and that's really the goal of framing it like this. For many people, vehicle ownership is either their most expensive category or their second most expensive household category, right? So this is a huge expense, and were people allowed to forgo that expense, perhaps it could reduce their poverty. It examines the external costs of building to the status quo. It asks, are people who would choose to not own a car allowed to live here comfortably and safely? And it fosters the development of better places. So this is why we think it would be important to use this transportation choice captivity matrix. Here are the limitations, right? We need more data, better data. I think everyone in this group has the same problem as us. Be great to have more and better data. Localized analysis, this would be best applied, I think, at a very local level to look at how individuals are interacting with their systems. Obviously, a national transportation analysis says very little about the very localized nature of transportation systems. Introducing other characteristics regarding the built environment, and then applying this framework more widely, maybe taking an international perspective. All of these things are something that we plan to look into further. Thank you. So if you have any questions, please contact me, Dr. Garrick, or Dr. Atkinson-Palombo, and I will take any questions now if we have time.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Morrow. Do we have any questions from the audience for this presentation? In the chat, hey, when I just come to the US a few months ago and now live in the suburbs of Charlotte, I find it really inconvenient to walk over here. Most places have only one side of sidewalk, and it is very narrow. What is the reason for this? To save the land? So this is a question for the student.
That's a great question. So I did previously work for a DOT, so I can speak to this a little bit. But I think it depends on your local government and how they prioritize their street systems. I found that in many places when you prioritize street traffic, they don't require sidewalks. There's no need for sidewalks. They weren't prioritized for many years. So when they go to add sidewalks in after, there's not enough room in the right of way, which is the land that they've already agreed to purchase from the surrounding landowners, to add two sides of the road sidewalks or sidewalks on both. And they don't want to detract from the number of lanes on the street because people get mad about that. So I think that it's a very localized circumstance, but that's one of the situations that I've seen in real life. You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so do we have more questions from the audience? Okay. Okay, thank you, Ms. Morgan, for this interesting presentation. Okay, so let's move to the next presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Wei Fan, the director of our center from University of North Carolina at Charlotte. The topic of his presentation today is modeling and evaluating public transit equity and accessibility by integrating general transit feed specification data. Let's welcome Dr. Fan.
Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yi. So I'm going to be really quick and make up for some time. Okay, so the topic of my presentation today is modeling and evaluating public transit equity and accessibility by integrating general transit feed specification data. So this is a work primarily did by my student, Yang Li, who's working at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee right now. Did pretty much all the heavy weight lifting. So this is based on some results of the research project that we worked for USDOT. So here's the overview of my presentation today. So again, introduction, and then talk about objectives, and the methodology would develop, and then one case study was conducted, and some numerical results would like share with you, and the conclusion withdrawn, and also give some future research direction. So as we all know, public transit is a critical component from both economic and social perspective. And the research for evaluating, improving, and planning a more accessible and equitable transportation system is challenging, but extremely important. On the other hand, the GTFS data are available and becoming increasingly popular, which provide basically new opportunity for transit performance measurement and benchmarking, as well as research, particularly in the field of transit equity and accessibility. So the purpose of this research project is to model and evaluate public transit equity and accessibility using the GTFS data as a major data source. We're going to provide some recommendations for future research direction as well.
Dr. Fan, excuse me. Your slides kind of stay in the first slides. It's not in the slideshow mode. Could you please turn on slideshow mode and then it can process to the next slides?
Okay, let me see. Okay. My slides is actually moving. Can you see the slides moving here?
I only can see the first slide.
Really?
Sorry about the other people.
Maybe you can share the screen for not this screen, because we can still see not see the full screen.
First screen, huh? Okay.
Okay.
So on my end, the slides are moving actually.
Now it's moved to next one, the second one, but it's still not in the slideshow mode. So we can see the this like not the presentation mode. So can you switch to the slideshow mode?
Okay. Just this, okay, right? Can you see that?
Yes. Yeah, now it's moving.
Okay.
Yeah, it's moving. Okay, good.
Okay, sorry about that. So we're getting to the transit supply. As we all know, in the transportation field, at the end of the day, the level of service provided by any facility or system is determined by both the supply and the demand. And there's no exception here in our research. So this slide basically deals with the transit supply. Well, the transit stop station coverage ratio is computed by using this equation. As you can see here, the transit stop station coverage ratio equals to the number of residential units covered by stop I within half a mile walking catchment area divided by the total number of residential units. And we use a half a mile instead of considering a quarter mile as acceptable walking distance, which actually was used in most previous studies, because we believe half a mile actually is a more reasonable walking distance for use to capture the transit-dependent population. And certainly, the distance would vary based on the type of transit service. For example, people are generally willing to walk even further when they take a light rail instead of bus. And then this slide, basically, as you can see, we may have different areas, but overlapping in nature. So we make sure that the overlapping areas will not be double counted. And then these slides basically talk about the supply. So as you can see here, the per capita maximum daily available seats estimate the level of service provided by the transit service for the total population within one block area, other than the people who have access to service, by considering both the frequency and the capacity of the transit service here. So this parameter basically presents an average daily basic service level of service for specific block groups served by all relevant public transit services. And then finally, the transit supply and service score can be computed by multiplying the transit service coverage ratio and per capita maximum daily available seats. So in a sense that the transit service score covers the spatial and the temporal characteristics for the public transit service. Okay. Now, these slides basically talk about transit demand side. So we all know that transit-dependent population typically consists of people who are too young, maybe too senior, or maybe do not have vehicles available to them, or physically handicapped, cannot drive. And so this is basically the definition of the transit-dependent population. And then somehow we convert the traditional calculation to a new calculation here. So as you can see, we first calculate the household driver equal to population age 16 and over minus persons living in the group quarters. So the group quarters is defined as a place where people live or stay in a group living arrangement manner, which is owned or managed by an entity or organization providing housing for the resident. There are two types of group quarters, basically. One is institutional and the other is non-institutional. So the institutionalized population living in the group quarters include those, such as correctional facilities, nursing homes, and mental hospitals. They typically move or travel together in a group manner instead of individually. On the other hand, the non-institutionalized population living in group quarters, such as dormitory, military barracks, group homes and missions and shelters, they will not. So that's why we calculate the transit-dependent population this way. So we also calculate the transit demand score as the transit-dependent population divided by total population here. And then the transit gap index here. So the values from both transit supply and demand will be standardized in a scale of 0 to 1, based on the equations shown here, as you can see. And then later on, the transit gap index can be then calculated by subtracting the TDS from the TSS for any block group J. And then this slide basically give us some ideas about the implementation framework. So the main tools utilized in this project are ArcGIS and SQL query, and the GTFS is the main data source we used for calculating the transit gap index. And this slide basically shows the GTFS data when we upload the data in ArcGIS format, and then we get the City of Charlotte network as shown here, and also we did some SQL query as well. Then this slide shows the case study we conducted for the City of Charlotte, and the data we used from we gathered on the web from different sources. And then this slide shows the distribution of vehicles, populations, people living in group quarters, and in the City of Charlotte, and also the North Carolina statewide system, non-system road system, things like that. We are getting to the numerical results here, as you can see. So the transit supply, as you can see here, we categorize the transit supply score into 7 classes. As you can see highlighted here, from very low to very high. So basically the 60% of the total transit dependent population, which accounts for about 15% of the total population within 247 block groups, have poor public transit service, whose TTS score are either very low or low. And then we're getting to the transit demand side. So we also categorize the transit demand score in the population. About 32.5% or so of the transit dependent population. So that's the total here in Charlotte area. was living in the area with a high transit need, a category from high to very high. And then the transit gap, as you can see, the medium to high category ranked the highest in terms of both transit-dependent population and number of block groups. And more than 40% of the transit-dependent population is residing in the category of a medium to high gap area. And then we also have a kind of like a coordinate system. As you can see here, X means the transit supply, Y means the demand. Then we identify different areas. For example, here, left-hand side, which is the low supply but high demand, which is deficiency, transit deficiency area. And then the bottom right-hand side here, so we have high supply but low demand, which is, we talk about a transit redundancy area here. And then the conclusion, so we developed a new transit supply and demand models, and also identify the transit gaps for evaluating equity and accessibility using the GTFS data as a major data source. And a systematic solution framework was also designed and implemented using City of Charlotte as a case study. And in the future, actually, we published one paper as a follow-up study trying to optimize the transit infrastructure investment based on the framework work we developed in this research project. And then in the future, we're considering trying to integrate the OD metrics into our models as well. And some other socioeconomic factors could be included as well. So in terms of technology transfer activities, we published 2 papers in the Journal of Transportation Engineering Part A system. So back in 2020, and also this year, early on this year, we have 2 research reports published as well. If you're interested, you're more than welcome to explore them to gather more information. And then with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. If you have any questions, I would be glad to answer.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Fan. Any questions from our audience? Okay, it's a very interesting presentation. I have some questions, Dr. Fan. I'm glad you analyzed the base, both supply and demand for the transit system. Can I ask you, when you estimate the demand, and did you consider the household income, poverty level, and for the because this will affect their demand for the transit. If the people cannot own a car, they definitely need a transit service. So in your model, did you consider this factor, like economic factor, in your model?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yi, for your question. So we actually consider collectively as a group at the census group level. We're not considering, individual household income level and things along those lines. We basically get the census data. We have the populations, different income level, different age distributions, things like that. But we're not getting to the individual household level.
Okay, I see. Okay. Thank you. Very, very interesting research. Okay, so any questions from audience? Let me see the chart. Not yet. Okay, if you have questions, I think you can also contact Dr. Fan later. And let's move on to our next presentation. Thank you, Dr. Fan. Okay, good. Our next speaker is Dr. Timothy James Becker from University of Hartford. The topic of his presentation is using computational biology to mitigate path overlap in transit assignment. So let's welcome Dr. Becker. Dr. Becker, are you ready?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Yes, I'm all set. Thank you.
Great. So could you please share your screen? Then you can start your presentation.
Okay, let me know if you see, I should have a title slide. Can everybody see?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm going to do the slideshow presentation. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and proceed with my slides. Thank you very much for having me present at this symposium today. My co-PI on Project 10 is Dr. Nicholas Lowndes from UConn. I actually started, even though my background is computer science and engineering, and my PhD is from UConn in computer science and engineering, I did graduate work with Dr. Nicholas Lowndes on Title VI equity analysis. So I worked with him for a while from Connecticut Transportation Institute. So I have some background and some interest in transportation engineering, mostly the mass transit and the buses. And I worked together with my mentor, Dr. Nicholas Lowndes, in this area. Normally he would present, but I am standing in today, and I'm going to kind of walk you through a computational method. So our work is a little different from the previous two presentations. It involves more algorithm and more general purpose implementation. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm currently an assistant professor at University of Hartford, and Dr. Nicholas Lowndes is associate professor at UConn School of Engineering, Civil and Environmental Engineering. So this particular project we had discussed for a while. In my prior work, we had been working with GTFS, and we work closely with the Connecticut DOT. Their provider is CT Transit. So we also worked with the CT Transit real-time data. This project is dealing with basically transit assignment. And in particular, simulation is a really powerful way to analyze system behavior. And also it's used when CT Transit here in Connecticut wants to plan a new route or take away a new route. So it's very good for planning. It's also very good for Title VI to ensure that we have equitable transit. So that's the sort of the area in transportation that we're working with is transit assignment. And in our work, we found that existing path choice models and simulations, they have some deficiency. They use logic models, and the logic models that are used assume some level of independence. And we found that this was just because they needed something. So the authors in these papers agreed that it was a deficiency because assumptions were violated, but they wanted to move forward and do some analysis. So we really liked their work. However, we had some ideas on how to deal with the overlap and to basically provide something else other than a logic model that has naturally violated assumptions. Specifically, we're dealing with path choice overlap, which is basically much of the path choices that are available are very, very similar. And we have a computational method that we developed in this project to deal with that. So just some quick background. Google Transit Feed Specification has been around for a while. It's been widely used here in Connecticut since around 2015 or so. A leading dynamic transit path assignment tool called Fast Trips came up with a method which is basically moving people, not the buses. So often, bus companies are focused on, like we saw in the previous slides, looking at zones. So connecting an OD zone or a TAS to a destination TAS. In fact, as a result, the modeling is spatial temporal, and it's very finely grained. So it's at the second. So everything that we do is per second. And the long story short is that they made some wonderful strides in their work because they went at a very fine grain, but the issue is they had to use a logic model. So our work is focused on the deficiency of that prior dynamic modeling. we'll start first with how fast trips measures the goodness of a path, and they do that in seconds. And so this is a time cost. So basically you have the individual walks or the access and egress time to the O and the D section, so getting on a bus or off a bus. And then you also have, in the case of transfers, there's some walking or some waiting, and those are also measured in time. Now, each one we would consider a different mode. Waiting would be one mode and walking is another mode. And finally, the time, the total time could be incorporated as well. So we have the temporal, that's the traditional. If we come up with an equation, the penalty function that we use looks like this. So basically we take all the possible modes. In our work, we focus on in-vehicle is a mode that has, if we see here, the coefficient is 1. So we just measure the time linearly. And then we have a fixed penalty offset of 0 for in-vehicle. Now, traditionally, we increase the coefficient for waiting or walking, and we also add some fixed offset for a penalty. This penalty model, when you then search for all the paths, is going to have a lower cost for a direct trip. It's also going to have a lower cost if you have to walk or wait less. Now, because we're focused on dealing with overlap, we developed a secondary metric, and the metric basically is designed to measure similarity among all paths. So we'll get into some of the theory here because it may be new, and in fact, it is fairly new in this field. A sequence, which is simply, if you're on one bus, it's going to be the series of stops that bus makes to get you from origin to destination. We model it as a spatial temporal sequence. And in computational biology, we have studied sequences for a while. So a sequence is different from a set in that the order is very important. And the order is important when you are on a bus from origin destination. And so we used for our motivation, the longest common subsequence. And you can see the recurrence relation below. The longest common subsequence simply is counting the number of stops that would appear in order. So if we compared an express bus trip to a local bus trip, they would have maybe the origin and destination in common. That LCS value between the short to the long would be 2. You'd have the origin and destination in common. All the inner trips would be different. And we're going to move forward. If you have an interest in any of the mathematics, we have plenty of references for you. So this was the motivation. However, this is not a spatial temporal. This simply has the order of sequences. So in our work, we modified it for transportation engineered to include the spatial temporal components. So instead of simply matching a bus stop, we first create little sigma AB. And little sigma AB, we use just a Euclidean latitude longitude calculation because it's easy to compute, but there are many spatial distance functions. So you can provide any spatial distance function. If you want to use OpenStreetMaps and do a network distance function using walking paths, then that's fine. If you could use that same network for driving paths, any of them will work. For simplicity, we just include the Euclidean distance here for spatial distance between stop A or point A and B, we call little sigma. We then use little sigma and we apply a diffusion function, which is to say we use the walking distance. So walking distance, typical one is around a half mile. And so if 2 stops are within half a mile, they're going to get an approximate match to each other. That approximate match, as you can see, is taken away from the normal term 1. So in the previous equation, you always add 1 for a perfect match. In our approximate match version of it, we're going to subtract using the diffusion function, however far away you are from walking. So if you're very close, you're going to end up very close to 1. And if you're at the very edge of where somebody would walk, you're going to be benefiting very little from that. So you can think of it as approximate match, whereas LCS is exact match. Okay, so then the issue with LCS is that the LCS by nature is asymmetrical. If I compare a very short express to a very local, I'm going to end up with a very small value. And then if I switch them around and I compare a very large value to a smaller one, I'm going to end up with a very different numerator. So there's a very simple way that we deal with asymmetry is that we compute forward and backwards. So we do the LCS with transfer of XY, and then we also compute, we use the numerator of X and the numerator of Y, and then we use the harmonic mean. And so this creates a symmetric, in other words, this forms a metric. Without that, we wouldn't have a metric, okay? And so in this work, we desire a metric, and so we create the normalization and produce the one of the three requirements for a metric, which is symmetry. That calculation gives you sequence to sequence. So basically, this gives us the ability to measure a similarity of one potential path versus another. And then the question is, well, how do I compare one path against all the other ones that are available to that particular person? And the answer is computational biology. We have several solutions to this. And in our work, we applied a very easy to understand, which we call sum of pair scores. And sum of pair scores uses the harmonic mean of the LCI, which is shown here in the very first term in our summation. So we take that and we work across all the potentials. So we look at every possible path in the path set. And then we look at that path against all other paths that are available. So for example, if I have 5 paths, I will take the first path, let's call it A, and I compare against all the other 4. And what we are calculating is simply how far each of the paths are against the other set. And so this we call delta X. It's the sum of pair scores of X. It's a measure of the uniqueness. So it tells you how unique is X compared to all other paths that are available. Finally, we use the SP score. We connect it back again to our original metrics, which is time cost. And we do that through interpolation. And we provide an interpolation function here. We pick a value K. K is our approximation term. So we're, instead of producing all, let's say 1,000 paths, we're interested in K equals 10. So we want to know 10 very interesting paths. And if I look at 2 metrics, which is cost, and I look at the other metric, which is uniqueness, this interpolation function is going to give me the very best time, but it's also going to give me the very most unique. And it's going to interpolate the other K minus 2 in between. And so we start at K and we simply, we look at we do an optimization calculation. And first we look at beta X, which is the time cost. And so when K is 1, the very first value, we're going to look for the very best cost, because 1 minus the weight on the right-hand side of the addition and the minimization term will be 0. And so this will select the very lowest cost, which is the same as we would normally get. However, as we increase into K to the very final value, now the left-hand term, the cost, is very minimal, and the right-hand side of the term is very important, which is to say the most unique of the paths. And so it gives you a nice approximation of the overall path, which could be 1,000 for an urban environment. And now we have it set to 10 very interesting and very beneficial paths. Of course, the algorithm is great and the math is wonderful, but we were interested in applying this. And so Dr. Lowndes had a wonderful data set that he worked on from 2016. And this rider was, we have GTFS data from that ridership, but they looked at actual people that were coming into work into the Hartford area. And then we went into that data set and we found specific people that were going to work within the weekday. And we were interested in people that needed a transfer, because the transfers are much more complex. The transfers create a much higher complexity. And as a result, they're very difficult to analyze. You have thousands or hundreds of thousands. And so we use this data set and we analyze our algorithm on it. And so I'm just going to skip ahead. We used 10 for our value K. And then I created a series of plots so we could analyze the results. When K is 0, it's going to show up in red. And this is the very best path. In this particular person, it was person 17. It was their trip 0. They're traveling from one section of Hartford to another. And you can see the road network is shown in white. And the very best path is shown in red. So it's the very first top red. And you can see it's also a little shorter than some of the other ones. And that time range is between 1144, 1153 start and 1240 to 110. So you can see there's a large variation in time. As you go along to green, you can see there's some unique portions, and it looks like just to the top section here, you can see that's the unique portion that the high value of K achieved. What you're actually going to also see too is that when K is 5, that's somewhere in between the two. When you're looking for unique and low cost, you end up with this nice orange branch. So you can see the potential paths for person 17 kind of had two main different paths that they could take to work. If you look at only the similarity, we take the similarity SP score matrix and we produce a multidimensional scaling of it. You can see that there's actually two kind of discrete clusters. You have the reds on the left, and then you have the orange on the right. So if I go back to the previous one, we can see it in the map too. We have a unique orange and a unique red. And in the NDS, you can see you have two unique clusters. The green are also unique, but they are simply adding additional time. And finally, if we plot low to high similarity against low to high cost, you can see that algorithm basically takes the lower values. So the lower left to right, we're always selecting. You can kind of see which ones are selected. Now, I just want to point out the gray ones are all of the potential paths that you would normally have to look at. So the purpose of the algorithm is to approximate, give you all of the most interesting values out of the path. And as you can see here, we've selected automatically a very nice set of paths, and we've excluded a very large, somewhere around 600 or 700 paths have been excluded they're basically very similar to the other ones. Let's look at some more. In this person 24, there ended up being many potential ways for them to get from their origin and destination. And likewise, there is a differential of the start and end time of somewhere around 40 minutes. And as you can see, there's an orange, a red, a yellow, a green. There's at least 6 clusters. And of course, as we MDS that, we can see that that's true too. Even with K10, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 clusters that appear using similarity alone. When we plot all of the paths, we can see we're selecting a very interesting set of paths, and we're excluding all of the ones that are very similar to each other. Many of them are very, very high cost. And person 20 has a very simple, we can see here, there really are 2 or 3 clusters, and there's very little variation for them. You can see there's 3 clusters in the MDS. And again, we're selecting, in this case, the very most interesting. Notice how many of the paths that are available are very high cost, meaning that the person would be waiting, hours. So they're not very good paths. Finally, if we put that all together and we look at all of, we had 28 people in this data set, we just looked at a few. If we put it all together, the selecting K makes a lot of sense. We can set K to be much higher, but often there's only a few really interesting paths. Many of the other ones are simply a transfer point change. So the transfer has just moved a little bit. If we look at these histograms, we can see we can eliminate many, many direct paths. So this just shows you all the people. Out of all of the 38, the direct paths, there's around 36 direct paths that are available. Now, many of these people reported a transfer, but in our algorithm, we were able to find direct paths. So there must be some other reason other than cost, because we found more direct paths than they had reported. Interestingly enough, as we get into one transfer pass, we can see that we're able to eliminate, hundreds of potential one transfer pass. There are hundreds that are not very important that we can eliminate. Finally, when we get to 2 transfer pass, we can eliminate thousands. And finally, your longer, more complex pass, we're able to eliminate somewhere around 100,000 pass. And this is for 30 individuals. As you can imagine, if you're applying this to a bigger network, or you're looking at more than 30 people, you're going to end up with millions of paths that you can eliminate. Okay, so our discussion is that we developed K-paths, and it makes a significant reduction in 1 and 2 transfers. 3 transfers, it's beyond significant. It is very, very significant. We think that our work would directly affect a deep TAP algorithm such as fast traps, because instead of using a logit, we could set a realistic number of K-paths to be something still very large, somewhere around 50 or 100. And that would benefit the runtime of fast trips on large networks, such as New York or Boston. Finally, we believe that our framework, the cost to similar K-path algorithm, so by reducing these, you can now take the DATP and scale individual people at very large urban networks. And that's, of course, by design. This is really what we designed it for. Future directions for us is the path similarity could account for some of the behavioral selection, but other metrics might exist to get us closer to what the people had reported. So some people reported a transfer and we're not sure why. Maybe they knew they were shopping, maybe they were excluding the danger zones. So there are other metrics that we could use to create more complex and more realistic simulation. And of course, we could use more work to make all of our ideas into production ready. So in order for large transit authorities to actually use and run our software. We would like to acknowledge the funding that we received. Also, my Office of Sponsored Programs, University of Hartford's a small school, and I made good contacts so we could fill out our paperwork. We want to thank Dr. Lowndes, his Ph.D. student, Assad Tanver, who worked on a lot of background. He did put together the walk distances using ArcGIS, and he did a lot of analysis for it. And also Dr. Eric Jackson from CTI, he did the comments on our final report. So thank you very much. I will take any questions if you have it.
Thank you, Dr. Becker. Now is the time for questions. Do we have any questions from our audience for Dr. Becker? Okay, so maybe there are some questions later. So thank you, Dr. Becker. Very interesting research.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's move on to our last speaker. Our last speaker is Dr. Mehdi Azimi from Texas University. He's my co-worker. So today he's going to present his research work on the topic of analysis of intermodal vessel-to-rail connectivity. So Dr. Azimi, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, great. We can hear you.
Okay, let me share my screen.
Okay, great.
Can you see my screen right now?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. So let me have the presentation mode. Okay, hello everyone, good morning. The topic of our research is vessel-to-rail intermodal connectivity analysis for the Port of Houston. I would like to mention at first and the beginning that this work has been mainly done by my graduate students, Enamul Klein-Fayek, who has graduated this semester. So my presentation includes 5 parts. I will start with introduction and then move to the background, in which I try to clarify terms as well as procedures that are used in the current system. I will then discuss about the methodology, and later on I will talk about the results. And finally, I will conclude my presentation with some remarking comments. For introduction, freight transportation is a crucial element of the economy and development of regions, as you know. It's growing pretty rapidly, and it's a growth in the road sector. And when we are talking about in the road sector, we mean that freight trucking is rapidly offsetting the benefits through such impacts as congestion, noise, pollution, and what else I can say, environmental damage, for example. Alternative transportation solutions such as a combined transportation network can actually help reduce these impacts. To make transportation more efficient, different modes of transportation are being used now these days, and it really depends on availability, capacity, and probably their cost. Rail intermodal is the long-haul movements of shipping containers by rail combined with a truck or water movements at one or both ends. Rail water intermodal transportation broadly means with the premise of rail transportation and water transportation as the main, compatible with other modes of transportation to accomplish the complete transfer of those containers to the second mode, we can say. As United States economy grows, the need to move more freight will also grow. And the recent forecasts from the Federal Highway Administration found that the total US freight shipments will rise from an estimated about 19 billion tons that was in 2018 to 24 billion tons in 2040. You see that it is about 30% increase. With the increased traffic in the marine ports, the traffic congestion in the highways associated with the ports is likely to be increased at the same time, simultaneously. The ground numbers will slowly captivate the capacity of the highways, and truck movements will be a huge burden on the economy, causing delays and loss because the time is delays and money cost because time is money. So the rail intermodal system can be the perfect substitute when it comes to reducing the congestion while coping with the increasing demand for the freight of the system. So next slide. We focus on the Port of Houston because as a fast-growing port, the Port of Houston Authority has grown to be a very important port because of its large tonnage handling capacity and its impacts on the nation economy. With the growth in the economy, which results in increased port activities, the Port of Houston is gradually approaching capacity and see the need for expansion of infrastructure needed for service efficiency provided, for example. So the goal of this study was to help identify critical factors and recommend processes that will promote the competitiveness of the vessel-to-rail intermodal system at the Port of Houston in handling and servicing future economic growth. To achieve this goal, we have several objectives. We identified the key components of a vessel-to-rail intermodal system. We studied the current operations at Port of Houston container terminals. We compared the competitiveness of the Port of Houston among similar ports in the nation and pinpoint the gap between the existing condition of the Port of Houston and the state-of-the-art practices. And finally, we evaluate the feasibility of rail intermodal system compared to truck freight in the Port of Houston. Let's move on to the background part. What is intermodal transportation? Intermodal transportation is the use of two or more modes or carriers to transport goods, that is, we mean freight, from shipper to consignee. In other words, intermodal freight transportation involves the transportation of freight in an intermodal container or we can say vehicle using multiple modes of transportation. Those modes can be rail, ship, aircraft, or truck. And that is without any handling of the freight itself when changing the modes. And there are some for intermodal transportation. There are some advantages. For example, it saves time, reduces shipping costs. We can achieve economy of scale. That is very important. It ensures increase capacity, limits risk of damage and theft, and minimizes environmental damages. But at the same time, it requires additional facilities and higher infrastructure costs. And there are some supply chain coordination issues that must be addressed to make an intermodal system efficient. Vessel to rail intermodal system. Why we should prefer this system over other systems? As said in the previous slides, rail intermodal is the long-haul movements of containers by rail combined with a truck or at one, or we can say both ends. Intermodal allows the railroad, ocean carriers, ocean carriers, and other stakeholders, for example, trucking companies and intermodal customers as well, to take advantage of the best attributes of various transportation modes to yield an efficient and cost-effective overall freight movement. Whenever we are thinking about any logistic strategy, we must answer two primary questions. The questions are, how can this strategy benefit the business? And what is the value proposition? Here comes why we prefer vessel-to-rail intermodal system. First, it has lower costs. Shippers can take advantage of lower rates, more predictable pricing, and flexibility of loading and unloading goods. That we can say it reduces handling costs ultimately. Additionally, on average, railroads are 3 to 4 times more fuel efficient than trucks, meaning that higher fuel prices puts trucks at a relative disadvantage when we compare to railroads. And because it uses less fuel, definitely it will be more environmental friendly. Shippers can significantly reduce their carbon footprint by going intermodal, because trains only emit approximately about 5 pounds of carbon dioxide per 100 ton miles, whereas truck emit approximately 20 pounds per 100 ton miles. One train on average can move 1 ton more than 470 miles on 1 gallon of fuel, which lowers greenhouse gas emission by about, you can say, if I remember correctly, 75% compared to trucks. Talking about capacity, we should mention reliability. Shippers have more access to equipment and standardized transit schedules with having more capacity. It will be more reliable. As companies move their freight to intermodal, there is also the opportunity to streamline their reverse logistics, providing additional savings and reliability. And safety advantages that it has, it is a safer mode. In this slide, we talk about the container transfer process in port terminals. In this graph, in the right side, you see that when a ship arrives at a terminal, import containers are unloaded by cranes, which remove the containers from the ship's deck and place them into the yard trucks, and then they move to the stack. The yard in the middle, you see in the middle of the slide. The yard cranes then move it to the after a while, a certain period of the time, the containers are retrieved from the stack by the yard containers and placed onto the road truck, or it can be trained for delivery to the recipients. And this process can be reversed for an export container. In this part, we will discuss about components of a vessel-to-rail intermodal system. We have container cranes, railroads, and rail intermodal yards. That is the main components of the vessel-to-rail intermodal system. So we talk about the rail intermodal yard because that is the core of the vessel-to-rail process. And it is the location where unit trains are loaded and unloaded from the yard trucks by a type of train that is named RTG, that is rubber tire gantry crane. And the efficacy of the vessel rail intermodal transportation system is analytically reliant on the progression by which marine cargoes are moved between ship and rail. And the vessel to rail transfer process generally takes place in the intermodal rail yards. And these yards are commonly categorized according to their relative locations. We have three types of rail intermodal yards, on dock, near dock, and off dock rail intermodal yards. First, let's talk about on dock rail intermodal yards. For on dock rail intermodal yards, we know that the yard is for transferring the cargo, that is the container, to the rail. So if you would like to know what is an on-dock rail intermodal yard, it refers to a container yard that is situated within the port area. On-dock intermodal yards can be different based on their configuration. When an intermodal yard is an essential part of a container yard and generally handles cargo containers in the same way, it is called a live on-dock intermodal yard that we have in this slide. In this process, the same yard equipment is used in the container yard. The containers are transferred directly from the ship to the RTG without any intermediate storage, either at the container yard or a special buffer storage near the working tracks. Since this configuration handles the container from ship to the rail without any intermediate storage place, it is called a live on-dock intermodal container yard. So the system is operationally considered to be most efficient as it disregards the additional lifting equipment as well as storage space for the containers. It is the fastest system that can be handled the ship to rail process. However, it requires all the containers to be customs pre-cleared. And the ship stowage is aligned with the rail stowage in this type of yard. Therefore, in order to perceive the true advantage of this system, the unit trains are required to be dedicated and line controlled. So going to the next one for the on-dock intermodal yard, we have drop on-dock intermodal yard. When an intermodal yard is inside the marine terminal but physically separated from the container yard, it is called drop on-dock intermodal yard. In the system, the working tracks are located at the back of the terminal. Therefore, the transfer from ship to rail will be indirect. The containers are stored in the container yard at first. After getting a clearance from the customs authorities, the containers are released and transferred to the intermodal yard where they are loaded on rail cars by yard equipment. In comparison with the live on-dock system, this type of yard, I mean the drop on-dock intermodal yard, has the disadvantage of requiring an extra in-terminal drayage. Another setback of this system is the longer processing time for customs clearance compared to the live on-dock system. Now we are talking about near dock intermodal yards. Near dock adjacent intermodal yards are usually located outside the marine terminal and customs area. Most of the time, these yards are larger than the undocked ones, since it is hard to acquire large space within the marine terminal. So they go outside the marine terminal to have more space, more lands. Near dock rail intermodal yard can be adjacent and non-adjacent. Non-adjacent ones are usually located within 5 miles radius of marine terminals, and they allow handling of domestic and marine containers. They lower the costs by not requiring special processing gates, and it frees the valuable lands and often larger than adjacent ones, hence more efficient. Last is off-dock rail intermodal yard. This type of rail intermodal yard can be located up to 20 miles away from a port area. They are quite similar to the near dock and non-adjacent configuration, except for the fact that they are located in a much distant place. Due to the longer distance, cost and time increase at the same time. The main advantage of this system is the large size of the yard, and additionally, non-ports inexpensive labor costs can save more money, because in those areas we have more laborers that are looking for job, we can say. If you want to compare the different settings of rail intermodal yards, this slide illustrates it very clearly. The first row shows whenever we are using undocked rail intermodal system, containers are moved from ships to train directly. But the next two ones, the latter ones, are indirect process. The only difference is in the off-dock system, and that is the last one, is a truck has to cover larger distance to reach to the rail. Before going to the next part, let me briefly talk about this graph and fuel consumption in different modes of transportation. Rail is a cost-effective and efficient way to move almost any freight in the United States, which benefits both producers and consumers. We can say because of the technological and advancement and innovation, rail continues to be unrivaled by other modes for fuel efficiency. Trains are 4 times more efficient than trucks, moving 1 ton of freight about 500 miles on just a single gallon of diesel fuel. Rail's lower fuel consumption also leads to lower carbon emissions and in overall. In this study, the information that we collected and data regarding various components of the vessel to rail intermodal system of different ports in the United States, as well as Port of Houston, were collected. The data and information were compared and analyzed to evaluate the efficiency and productivity of the Port of Houston. Next slides will be aimed at identifying how the intermodal freight transportation system is used by the Port of Houston, how effective it is, and identify where there are gaps or opportunities to improve its use and effectiveness. So the Port of Houston is a river port on the Gulf, as you see here in this map, in Gulf of Mexico. It's one of the 10 seaports along Texas coastline, and it is accessed through Gulf Intracoastal Waterway and the Houston Ship Channel connecting through Galveston Bay. Houston is the largest city in the state of Texas and the 4th most populous city in the US. The port is the largest one among the Gulf Coast ports, and you observed in the previous slide, it's currently ranked 6th in the terms of container volume and 1st in the terms of waterborne tonnage. As you see in this graph, the growth of the port of Houston has been gradual, and yet it is steady, as you see. The Port of Houston includes several terminals. So we have two major container terminals located relatively close to the Gulf of Mexico. However, most of the other terminals are located in the bayou part of the Houston Ship Channel. The most common terminals among those are bulk liquid terminals handling petrochemical products, chemicals, edible oils, and some breakables cargo. We mentioned that the Port of Houston has two major container terminals. Barber's Cut Container Terminal is one of them. It's owned and operated by the Port Authority. The terminal is located at the Galveston Bay, beginning of the Galveston Bay, and it's fully operated since 1977. The terminal has 6 berths, which provides about 6,000 feet of the continuous quay. This terminal has an intermodal rail service that is available through 42-acre near dock rail ramp. And the rail facility is located near the container terminal dock. However, the facility is not operational at this moment. We had an interview with the port operation manager for these two container terminals, and we were told that the last operational intermodal rail route was to Dallas once every week in 2019, and that was the Union Pacific. But they decided to eliminate their operation in these routes. That decision was a strategic one from the Union Pacific's point of view, since they moved their service to busier routes where there is probably more volume. We have the second container terminal is Bayport Container Terminal, is the major deep water port in the area. It's a relatively new terminal and is considered the most modern and environmentally sensitive container terminal in the US Gulf Coast. The terminal has a total of 7 container berths with a capacity of handle about 2 million TEUs, on a, which includes container yards and intermodal facilities. There are some other terminals that are private and not operated by the Port of Houston Authority, and none of them handle container cargoes and operations. Basically, they carry bulk and they handle bulk and liquid products, and they have in that slides. The Port of Houston is accessed by multiple major highways, and with increasing trade and tonnage passing through the ports, the number of trucks could significantly increase through these highways. Even though Houston is a diversified port handling most petroleum-based tonnage, a great deal of the port-related traffic is related to the containerized cargo. Houston container terminals typically have a 25-minute truck turnaround, but in fact, overall time for trucks that are serving the container terminals are much longer because of the traffic and highway congestion. In terms of rail facility, the port terminals contain access to 3 Class 1 railroad and direct pipeline network access. There is no on-dock rail intermodal yard, and but one near dock intermodal yard that I mentioned about it is not operational right now. And this map shows the Port Terminal Railway Association that that is around connects the different terminals around the Port of Houston Authority. In this research, we collected some information related to these ports in order to compare their vessels to rail intermodal processes with the Port of Houston. The major ports listed in this slide. One of them was Port of LA. That was America's most extensive and modern network of on-dock and near-dock rail services. So it has 7 on-dock, 1 near-dock, and 5 off-dock rail intermodal yard. You see that if you compare to Houston, you see that it has the active rail intermodal yard. So it has major trains, different types of trains, including Panamax train and Superpost Panamax train. And the intermodal yard has different technologies, for example, differential global positioning system and other technologies to track the containers within the ports. In the later part, we want to analyze the feasibility of the rail intermodal system to freight truck. Rail is obviously efficient over truck in terms of eco-friendliness and capacity. Introduction of double stack rail cars made rail competitive to 500 miles or so. Growth of rail is way slower than truck freight. The study aims to understand if and why rail cannot compete with truck within 500 miles distance. And we also want to know the key components to impede rail intermodal when it comes to shipping short haul. The following sections provides the competitiveness of the vessel to rail intermodal status of the Port of Houston in terms of different parameters compared to the other ports. For example, here you see that the major ports that we listed in that slides, when we look at the terminal area, Port of Houston stands 5th when total containerized throughput is concerned. When it comes to the area, it ranks 6th. And comparing it with, for example, Savannah Port, which stands 4th in terms of the throughput, the containerized area of the Port of Houston is almost more than 100% less than the Savannah Port. Whereas the throughput is only 50% greater than the Savannah is greater than Port of Houston. If we look at on-dock rail terminal, when compared to the 10 container ports of the US, the Port of Houston is one of the 3 ports that does not have any on-dock rail facility, active facility. All the top 4 ports, which stand above the Port of Houston, have at least 1 on-dock rail intermodal terminal. For train facility, the Port of Houston ranks number 6, while considering the number of Superpost Panamax cranes, it stands 8th among the top 10. The number of total cranes owned by the Port of Houston is below the mean, and that is about 43, and the median on top of the 10 containerized ports of the in the United States. To analyze the rail intermodal cost in the short haul distance, this study considered the distance from the Port of Houston to adjacent ports and estimated the cost based on several parameters. To make fair analysis, we consider distance from 50 to 1,200 miles, as you see in this figure. It must be mentioned that there is no public database for these cost values. Railway and dredge companies do not share information on a public platform. So the data were extracted through an interview and some journals, some previous published reports and websites to get a decision on the feasibility. The rail freights were assumed to carry about 320 TEUs in double stack cars, which is the maximum limit. And the truck data in the following figure, in this figure, was obtained from the analysis of cost per container against the distance. As you see in the plot, the point that the two lines intersect each other, the break-even distance from rail to compete the truck freight is slightly above 550 miles. The cost difference per TEUs in the shorter distance, less than 200 miles among these two modes is almost similar to the difference in the long haul. And rail intermodal is feasible, we can say, for a distance over 550 miles compared to a truck. To identify the dominating cost components in the rail intermodal shipping, we analyze the components against different distance bands to identify the key issues in the system. It is quite visible that all distance band that we have here in this graph, drayage cost actually dominates. Drayage cost is least dominating at above 1,000 miles distance, which is most suitable for rail intermodal shipping. And the next graph, we analyze the cost, attempted to figure out how the cost stands when there is a significant reduction in drayage. In this case, we applied a 15% and 25% to the previous graph that I showed you in the previous slide in drayage cost and rail intermodal, and compared with the existing cost analysis for the truck intermodal. So you can see that the drayage cost is the driving factor in the making rail intermodal more competitive in this situation. When we analyze the cost per container with a reduction of 15% drayage cost, it is observed that the rail intermodal could compete with the truck from the distance just above 400 miles. But when we reduce by 25%, that is the orange graph, rail intermodal seem to be feasible even under 400 miles. So we have some recommendation. Our recommendation are based on our study, and it was divided in two parts: general recommendation related to drayage, on-dock rail terminals, and terminal location and capacity, and also general recommendation to Port of Houston authorities. Let us start with general recommendation. For drayage, drayage cost can be reduced by improving intermodal connectors. Technology has a major role to play in this regard. An efficient method for matching available dray drivers in the shortest possible time can be a very significant way to increase dray, we can say, productivity. Some studies have been done to reduce the drayage cost to make the rail more feasible. For example, the work done by Marlek showed that centrally managed drayage operation could decrease drayage costs by 40 to 60%, which that helps a lot basically in choosing this option. So for on-dock rail terminal, on-dock rail does not necessarily mean on the port waterfront. Even it is within the premises of the port terminal, the direct shipping from ship to rail can greatly reduce handling costs compared to the dray movements through the highways and public streets. The benefits of fewer trucks on the highways should justify the public subsidies for the construction and operation of the container terminals with on-dock rail terminal yards. Gate congestion, which is also a matter of great concern in busy ports, can also be reduced with the solution of on-dock rail intermodal yard. For the terminal location and capacity, the suburbanization of rail intermodal terminals is increasing the transit time and dray cost. Public-private partnership reduce terminal and dray costs, and it will bring more intermodal traffic to the railroads. And the study found that the amount of investment is justified by the public policy benefits of reduced investment in highway network, the reduction in accidents and congestion, and and improvements in the environment. That was based on another study that we reviewed. So the recommendation to Port of Houston, the Port of Houston lacks an undocked rail terminal and port facility compared to similar ports in the US. Undocked terminals and sufficient crane facilities are helpful for the efficient port operation, and the Port of Houston must respond to these emerging needs. The existing containerized capacity to containerized cargo volume ratio does not match comparing with similar ports. The increased port traffic is likely to exceed the capacity in the coming years, providing the intermodal rail operation should be resumed, the one that is not in operation, to match the gradual container traffic growth at the Port of Houston. And public-private partnership should be become stronger to ensure an efficient and functional port operation. The congestion on highway around the port is likely to increase more if the growing traffic demand is entirely put on the freight truck. So the vessel to rail intermodal transportation should be guaranteed effectively, immediately, to ensure that the incoming future port traffic is not blocking or clogging up the highways around the port area and leaving significant carbon, we can say, footprint. And the conclusion for this study is rail intermodal has proved that it can compete with trucks. The double-stacked rail cars have emerged as a revolution, bringing more capacity of hauling and reducing the cost per container and carbon emission. However, the uprising, the growth of rail intermodal has been on a slow side compared to a truck traffic growth. Without increasing infrastructural capability and investment in railroad, the growing demand of freight traffic will have to be carried out by the already burdened highway network. We explained about that one. There is a clear role of public-private partnership and technology innovation initiative to construct on-dock rail terminals, increase operational facility and rail network capacity. Rail intermodal can provide so many benefits over the trucks, and if the drayage terminal capacity, location, and we can say configuration issues are addressed, it can be even compete with trucks within, for example, for 150 miles corridor. We have some limitation in this study. Reliable and extensive data from dray companies and port authorities, if they are available, they will provide better and more reliable results. The analysis can be carried out on a larger spectrum to understand a better picture of the whole country, and the port performance metrics can be established through in future to understand the efficiency of port terminals. That was the research that we done. If there is any question, I would be glad to answer.
Thank you, Dr. Azimi. Lots of good information in your presentation. Any questions from our audience for Dr. Azimi? Okay, I don't see any questions since we are running behind our schedule. So I will quickly wrap up this session. Thank you all for being here for this session, and thank you for all the speakers for their great presentations they give to us this morning. Now I'm going to turn the podium back to Dr. Wei Fan to wrap up this morning's activities. Dr. Fan? Hello?
Thank you, Dr. Qi. So this is a great technical session. Thank you very much for moderating. So coming up, so we're going to take a lunch break. So after, I think it's 41 minutes or so. So we're going to come back at 1 o'clock for the second keynote presentation to be given by Dr. Lawrence Relay. So again, see you about 40 minutes later at 1 o'clock. Thank you all very much. Yeah. Enjoy your break.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Yeah.